Hi everybody, tonight we're going to go over Krugman Module 2 and an introduction to macroeconomics. We're going to talk about four things tonight. We're going to talk about first the business cycle and unemployment and employment, what those are. We're going to talk about aggregate output. We're going to talk about inflation and deflation, and then we're going to talk about economic growth. We're going to cover these topics again as introductions tonight, and we'll get into much more detail in these in the coming weeks. Let's start with the business cycle. What does it mean? And you see here this wave, so you can see how it is cyclical. It starts up here and goes down, goes back up and goes back down. This is an overall level of measurement of business activity. This is time, and let's talk about what each of these steps in the business cycle are, what they mean. So the first, a peak in the business cycle is when business activity reaches a maximum, so a temporary maximum, with full employment or at near full employment with very, very high output relative to capacity. Unemployment rate here, because output is so high and it takes people in order to generate that output, unemployment is very, very low. Let's start over here. We would have seen here, excuse me, a peak. A recession happens when there is a decline in total output. That also means that there's going to be a decline in income because fewer people working, unemployment, and trade when all these things are going down, and it lasts 6 months or more. We're going to talk a little bit more later about how that gets defined specifically. There's a good box in Module 2 that talks about how recessions get measured and some of the nuances associated with it. Don't need to know that stuff for a test, but it is interesting stuff to know. Here again, unemployment is rising as overall business activity is declining. The trough, the bottom of this wave, is the bottom of the recession period. Unemployment is at its highest level, and you have business activity really at the lowest level that it gets. Recovery happens, so recovery starts here at the bottom of the trough, happens when output and employment are expanding. So there are more jobs, there's more output, there's more consumption going on, and now you're heading back towards a level of full employment. So there you have it. You have a peak of a business cycle. You have the beginning of a recession, which drives down business activity over time. You have the trough, where business activity is at its lowest and unemployment is at its highest. And then you have a recovery, which begins when people start getting employed again and output starts increasing. We'll talk in a second about what this upward trend line means. So entire business cycle is measured by the elapsed time between peaks in the cycle. So a business cycle is measured from here to here over the course of time. Let's talk about unemployment. So the second piece that we were going to talk about in here, we talked business cycle, now let's talk unemployment and employment. First, we need to get some definitions down, just know them. First of all, people with jobs are called employed. People who are jobless, are looking for jobs and available for work are called unemployed. That's one that you need to let sink in for a minute. Unemployed doesn't just mean you're not working. It means you're jobless, so you're not working. You are looking for a job and available for work. The third group of people, those who are neither employed nor unemployed, are not in the labor force. Importantly here, each person age 16 and over who's not in an institution, so a prison or a nursing home or a mental health care facility, nor on active duty in the armed forces, that's an important one too, nor on active duty in the armed forces is counted and classified in only one of these three groups. People who aren't in the labor force plus those in the civilian labor force constitute the civilian non-institutional population. Then that'll be important as we compute the unemployment rate. Also, remember there's no upper age limit for this group of people. Three quick examples. Elizabeth reported to the interviewer that she worked 40 hours as a sales manager. She's employed. Steve lost his job and a plant was closed down. He's been visiting personnel officers and he's trying to find a job. He's unemployed. Larry's a homemaker. Last year he was taking care of the house. He neither held a job nor looked for a job. His 80-year-old father hasn't looked or worked because of disability. Larry and his father are not in the labor force. Here's a quick look at two equations and then an example that I'm going to let you just pause and work through on your own if you want to. Labor force, or LF, equals employed plus unemployed. The unemployment rate, or UR, equals 100 times the unemployment rate over the labor force. Importantly, too, the unemployment rate is defined as the percentage of the labor force that is not employed. Again, not the total population, but it's the percentage of the labor force that is not employed. You can pause here, work through this. The math is pretty simple, and then we can talk about it tomorrow if you have questions. Now, moving on to the measure of aggregate output. I believe that was the third item we were going to discuss. Yep, aggregate output. For the purposes of what we're going to do in the next couple of days, think of aggregate output as the total production of goods and services for a given time period, which is usually a year. Keep in mind it's closely related to employment because it takes employed people in order to generate output. So when aggregate output goes up, people are generally employed more. When aggregate output goes down, so the economy weakens, fewer goods and services are being produced. Firms tend to lay off workers, which means employment is low and the unemployment rate is high. Let's talk about inflation and deflation. Here's a comic I found of Ben Bernanke, who entered into his position as the chairman of the Fed at a period of fear of rising inflation. Alan Greenspan had very low inflation for the majority of his tenure, and this is econ humor. Okay, inflation, a rise in the overall price level. Important to remember. Why is inflation bad? Well, it reduces our ability to purchase goods and services because the money that we have, that dollar of income, doesn't go as far if the prices of most goods and services are rising. Deflation is a fall in the overall price level. That can also be bad, and here's why. If prices fall, we tend to hold on to our money because we think that the price of items will get cheaper. What happens when we stop buying things? Producers make less product. And what happens when producers make less product? Well, unemployment may rise. Now, keep in mind, changes to the prices of a few goods, so let's say the price of oil and the price of TVs, if those prices change, it changes just the opportunity cost of purchasing those goods, but it doesn't constitute inflation or deflation. Keep in mind also that inflation and deflation instead are terms that are reserved for changes in the price of goods across the economy. We'll talk about things like the consumer price index later, and that's a good sign of inflation or deflationary pressure. Last, I wanted to show you within the context of economic growth really is defined as the productive capacity of the economy, and we'll talk about different ways that it gets measured over the course of time. I found this U.S. economic growth chart that goes all the way back to 1790. If you see here, it is actually real GDP. This measure of economic growth happens to be gross domestic product, which we'll talk tomorrow night. Here it's at $1,000 per person in 1790, going up to looks to be about $60,000 per person in 2006. And one of the important things to see here is that over time, that trend, the trend of U.S. economic growth since 1790 has been going up. While year over year and in the course of the business cycle, we will see changes like this upward trend that we discussed, or that we referenced here in the first slide, really is this overall upward trend as we go through business cycles that begin and end, begin and end, begin and end. All right, that's it for tonight. We discussed very briefly, we discussed the business cycle. We talked about unemployment and employment. We talked about aggregate output and inflation and deflation. That's it. Have a great night, and I will see you tomorrow.